So I've been speaking during this series about mercy and forgiveness, primarily focusing upon forgiveness. But I'd be remiss if I didn't at least speak once about mercy as action. Mercy as action for and with the poor. I once heard Mother Teresa in the cathedral in Canberra sharing such a resounding truth that struck my heart. These are her words. At the end of life, we'll not be judged by how many diplomas we've received, how much money we've made, how many great things we've done. We'll be judged by the words of Jesus, I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was naked and you clothed me. I was homeless and you took me in. And she said, hungry not only for bread, but hungry for love. Naked not only for clothing, but naked of human dignity and respect. Homeless not only for want of a room of bricks, but homeless because of rejection. This is Christ in the distressing disguise of the poor. It struck me how she emphasized hungry for love, naked of human dignity and respect, rejection. These are many of the deep wounds in our society at this time, I think. Many people lonely, feeling hopeless, dejected, without anyone to share. So Christ in the distressing disguise of the poor. So Jesus identified, didn't he, with the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the homeless, the sick, those in prison. They are our people because they are Christ. We meet him there. They belong to the church then in a special way, even if they don't profess the faith. They still are our people. Pope Francis says it this way. He says, sometimes we are tempted to be that kind of Christian who keeps the Lord's wounds at arm's length. Yet Jesus wants us to touch human misery, to touch the suffering flesh of others. So what matters most then is each individual person's need. We meet the person, and we meet Christ in a distressing disguise of the poor, to use Mother Teresa's phrase, the distressing disguise of the poor. He's disguised, as it were, but he is there. I remember Mother Teresa speaking in another venue when she was telling us about one of her sisters who was finding it difficult to encounter Christ in the distressing disguise of the poor, because they were going out into the streets of Calcutta and lifting people up and taking them to the house of the dying. And the sister was having struggle, to really, how can I meet Christ there? All I see is something terrible and it distresses me. So Mother Teresa said to her, well, look, at Mass tomorrow morning, when the priest takes hold of the host, just watch how he gently and carefully and caringly holds that host. And she said, when you go out to meet people, just remember that you're holding the same Christ. So that night, the young woman came back to the convent very excited because she had been to the streets. She'd picked up this man who had been really deeply affected by all sorts of diseases. And she'd taken him to the house of dying, and she washed him and cared for him and looked after him. And she said, I discovered, because it's the same Christ. The one that I love in the Eucharist is the same Jesus that I found in this man. So she's very excited, And that's a bit of a revelation for each of us, isn't it? That there's a bit of a conversion that needs to happen in our hearts in this way, because oftentimes we can be a bit sort of standoffish and a bit sort of shy and sometimes sort of even off-put in a profound way by people who might smell a bit, be difficult to get on with, people who are just sort of obnoxious in some way or another, and not find Jesus there because we're a bit sort of distracted by that. I want to tell you this too about Lawrence the deacon. Have you heard about Lawrence the deacon? Like he, in his day in the early church, he was in charge of the distribution of the food to the poor in Rome. And that was his job. His Bishop Sixtus, during a persecution, was being taken off to be put to death. And as Sixtus was going and Lawrence was following him behind, "Oh, Father, what am I going to do without you? What am I going to do without you?" And Sixtus turned to him and said, "Don't worry, you'll be following me in 3 days." So I'm predicting his martyrdom in 3 days' time. So Lawrence knew he had 3 days. So he decided to do something special. He told the Roman prefect, who was sort of the one in charge of all these killings, he said, I want you to come in 3 days' time to the square, and I'll bring to you the treasures of the Catholic Church, all the treasures of the Catholic Church. And the prefect said, "That's a good deal." Okay, so he came thinking that this Lawrence was going to sort of give him all these treasures to sort of win him on his side. And so when he arrived, he got a bit of a shock, this prefect, because all he could see was all the riffraff of Rome, all the poor and the shabbily dressed people and the raucous and loud and people. And he said, he looks around and he's astounded. He says to Lawrence, "Where are the treasures of a church? You promised you'd give me the treasures of a church." And Lawrence said, "Here they are. These are the treasures of a church." Well, of course, the Roman prefect was not very impressed. He ended up taking Lawrence off to be martyred as well. But of course, that's the truth, isn't it? These are the treasures of a church. Pier Giorgio Frassati in Turin, only a young man. He died at the age of 24 years of polio. At his funeral, his family, who were quite a wealthy family, were shocked at the number of people who turned up to his funeral. And most of them were poor people who his family had never even met. And there were great emotional scenes at the funeral. The family, his father was a wealthy newspaper magnate, and they had no idea that their son, who was a fun-loving man, but he had another love in his heart that they didn't know about. He'd go out quietly at night and use some of his father's money, mind you, to give to the poor and look after the poor, working with St. Vincent de Paul primarily, visiting the homes of Turin's poor, bringing food, clothing, money, helping to find accommodation, making sure they got health care, that sort of thing. Now, this was a young man who also had a great love for climbing mountains and geology and photography, and he had a girlfriend as well. He was quite an, ordinary young guy, but something that touched his heart. He said that Jesus comes to me every morning in Holy Communion, because he was a regular mass goer every day. Jesus comes to me every morning in Holy Communion, and then I go to meet him in the poor. He says, the house that I go into may be sordid, but I'm going to Christ. So he had the same experience, huh? The greatest joy was giving to others, not obtaining things. His father gave him many gifts, and every time he'd get the gifts from his father, it'd be handed on to the poor. The polio that killed him actually was contracted during his visits to the poor. And even on his deathbed, he was giving instructions about medicine for the sick man and another one that needed to renew his insurance policy and things like that. So he was a man who had a great love for life, found Christ in music, found Christ in art and poetry and high mountains because he loved to climb mountains. But most of all, he found Christ in the distressing disguise of the poor. And again, it's a witness to us, isn't it? That we know deep within ourselves that this is the truth. Yet sometimes it's difficult for us to actually take hold of it. Pope Francis warns us that we can become indifferent to the plight of the poor. So early in his pontificate, he visited the island of Lampedusa in the Mediterranean Sea, because at that time there were a lot of refugees taking sort of flimsy boats across the Mediterranean trying to get to Italy, to Lampedusa, on this small island. And most of them didn't make it. Many perished in the sea. And in the homily, which really touched me and many others I know, Pope Francis hits out at this indifference. He says, has anyone grieved for the death of our brothers and sisters, those that perished in the sea? Has anyone grieved for young mothers carrying their babies who perished? For these men who were looking for a way to support their families and were desperate, taking such desperate measures? You see, he was challenging the culture of comfort, which breeds indifference. Oh, it doesn't affect me. It doesn't concern me. It's none of my business. We've all got that in us, haven't we? He says we are a society which has forgotten how to weep, how to experience compassion, how to be in touch with the suffering of others. He talks about the globalization of indifference. It's taken away from us our ability to weep. Yes, I guess we think of the Jesus' story of the rich man, young man who clothed in purple and eating sumptuously every day, and the poor man Lazarus is at his doorstep, really, at his gate, and the man walked past him every day, probably, but didn't even notice him. He was indifferent to his plight, and this poor man Lazarus would have loved to have even just the scraps from the master's table. The dogs would come and lick his paws. But it was indifference that was in the heart of this man, rich man. And of course, at the end, he was perished in hell because he had not met with love. It's a wake-up call, isn't it? The satisfactions that we get all the time in our overly provided society, it dulls the mind and it hardens the heart. We don't want to share what we have, huh? I was shocked a little bit myself, and we need these salutary shocks, don't we? I had the opportunity of being in Uganda at one time a couple of years ago, and we went out to a refugee camp. And this we brought with us a lot of food. We had sacks of maize in particular, and we also brought boxes and boxes of clothes. And we thought we were doing really well. When we arrived there were so many people, and they were all lining up, and they got the women who had small children or the women who were pregnant to come first, and then the frail and elderly to come, but there just wasn't enough food, and there wasn't enough clothing either, and in the middle of it all, I started to weep, and that even made it even worse when some of the children the maize had all gone, but some of it had fallen on the ground, and I saw children picking it up in the dust from the ground. And others coming up and saying, "Is there more? Is there more?" And just realizing the situation that many people in the world live in, and that we, of course, are indifferent to this to a great degree and need to be shaken out of that. When you think that 1/3 of the world is consuming 85% of the world's resources, the other 2/3 are deprived. And when you consider that the richest 1% in the world earn half of the world's financial resources. So there's such a level of inequality that the Pope is drawing our attention to. And I think of that text from John Chrysostom that sort of haunts me sometimes. It's in the Catechism. That says, not to enable the poor to share in our goods is to steal from them and deprive them of life. The goods we possess are not ours, but theirs. So this is the Catholic teaching of universal destination of all goods that we can forget. And that we're meant to be sharing the goods that we have in the whole world. But unfortunately, the way the world is structured at the moment, the way the economy is structured, the way that our hearts are disposed, I guess, is that there's a great inequality. So what can we do is the question. It's not just a matter of feeling, but of doing mercy. Jesus was teaching this to his disciples, I think, when on the seaside there, of the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he was telling, that he'd been teaching people, and then the disciples said, look, it's getting late, there's not enough food, what are we going to do? Well, maybe tell the people to go and buy some food from the farms and the villages around. And Jesus says to the disciples, give them something to eat yourselves. And there were 5,000 men, not to mention the women and children. And Jesus said, how much do you have? They said, well, it's 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, bring them to me. So they brought what they had. And then he told the disciples to start feeding the people. And as they were feeding the people, more and more just kept coming. The miracle happened at the hands of the disciples. So Jesus was teaching them something. Always be ready to give bread to the hungry. Come to Jesus with what little they have and then do what he commands. So maybe there's something in that for all of us that we can really listen to in a new way. That, yes, there is a way in which all can be fed. There is a way that all can be cared for. There's a way that the poor can be met and be loved. The problem is in the human heart. Your heart and my heart has to expand more. Oscar Romero, one of the great men who really cared for the poor, Archbishop of El Salvador, when he wanted to explain what the option for the poor meant, he says, think of a building on fire and watching it burn. And then you're watching this fire burning and someone says, your mother and your sister are inside the building. Would you go to rescue them, you see? What would you do? You'd do anything to rescue them, So he say, don't look at poverty from the outside, but experience it as your people in distress, your people who are precious, who are being burnt up. And you'll do anything to alleviate their distress, It's been good for my heart to visit our mission in Manila, in the Philippines, where there's a squatter settlement called Payatas. Until recently, many of the people lived off what they picked up from the rubbish dump. And it's still one of the poorest squatter settlements in the world, really, where people are living often in very squalid and over-cramped conditions, limited access to water and food. So it's good for me to walk through the narrow alleyways of the slum. It's good for the soul to meet an elderly man sitting on a box outside his shanty asking for prayer. And glad to receive the food we've brought too, of course. But it's an encounter with Jesus, huh? This man may not be regular at Mass, but he's one of our people. He belongs especially to the Lord, huh? And hence to us. It's not that I have all that much to give him, although I do share with him the rice and some foodstuffs, but it's rather that he ministers to me. With his crooked smile and his shining eyes, his shabby attire and his twisted leg. And my spirit soars because I have met Jesus this day in the distressing disguise of the poor. So as we end this series, I want to thank you for being part of it. And maybe let's pray for one another. Let's pray that our heart will really be softened and opened up in mercy. Yes, mercy to forgive others, to forgive our enemies, to forgive those who have hurt us. And mercy that will lead us into action at times too, where we'll be able to see and feel and experience Christ hungry, Christ thirsty, Christ in prison, Christ in need, Christ needing shelter, Christ calling upon us to meet him in the distressing disguise of the poor. Bless his name.